Dr. Chris Timmermann to the stage.
Thank you for that, Albert, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all about these topics that I'm very passionate about, which is essentially how can we leverage psychedelic action to understand better the nature of our human experience. There is something, I think, quite inherent and intuitive for individuals having these experiences many times, that they're reaching something fundamental, something essential. And I think science can provide a way for us to understand that potentiality or that possibility. And then so I'm going to be speaking about our experiments using DMT and 5-MeO DMT, where we precisely explore those questions. How is it that psychedelics help us advance the science of the mind, on the one hand? And then the second part of the talk is understanding the opportunities and challenges that arise from this perspective when we're thinking about the use of psychedelics for advancing different mental health conditions. This is why it's called the fertile void, or the signal in the noise, the opportunities inherent within that state of deconstruction achieved by psychedelic experiences. And I'll be speaking mostly from the work that we've been doing, that we did when I was there at Imperial College London in these past 10 years, doing research with both DMT and 5-MeO. I will also be presenting some very fresh findings from case studies where we've had expert practitioners, an advanced meditator, lama, as well as an indigenous shaman who participated in our studies, to understand also the role of expertise in navigating these states, and again, leveraging the opportunities and challenges afforded by psychedelic experiences. And so the way that we do the research concerns neuroscience, but our approach tries to, in a way, incorporate the lived qualities of human experience in the ways that we do science. And so just to illustrate very quickly, usually when we do this kind of research in cognitive neuroscience, the standard approach is that you have a realm in which you map experience with questionnaires, and you have a realm where you map the brain using fMRI scans or EEG recordings. And the usual approach is that we average out the experience of individuals. We have an habitual experience there in point A, you zap that experience with a psychedelic drug, for example, and the outcome of that is an experience B. And then we take a photograph of each of those individuals in that normal state A and that state of alteration of consciousness B, and we average out all the nuance inherent between those individuals and within the trajectories of those experiences. And so this neurophenomenological approach, what it intends to do is it intends to incorporate the lived qualities of human experience and tracking the variability of that trajectory within the individuals and between individuals. And so where one participant can start at that point A, and both participants can maybe end in a similar area of point B, if you look specifically at their lived experience, you will identify a completely different trajectory. And that enables a better mapping and understanding of how these experiences relate to patterns of brain activity and brain dynamics. Okay, so the big question is, why employ psychedelics to study conscious experience? Why are these experiences valuable for us to understand structures of human experience? That is the main interest that I have. And the answer, the current hypothesis, is that psychedelics deconstruct or reconstruct core features, essential features of human experience. So one of those features is, for example, the way that we build the sense of self. And following this deconstruction, or this reconfiguration of these structures of human experience, psychedelics afford the opportunities to reconfigure these qualities of human experience, reconstruct the sense of self, potentially affording opportunities in terms of treating depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. And so we have a twofold approach. By understanding the psychedelic experience in terms of these deconstruction and reconstruction, we can study, for example, what are the biological processes that underpin lived experience and understand consciousness better. And on the other hand, we can leverage these opportunities to improve mental health and well-being. And the substances that I've used to employ this approach is DMT and 5-MeO. And so DMT is the compound present in ayahuasca. 5-MeO is the compound present in the Bufo alvarius toad, in the venom glands of the Bufo alvarius toad. And essentially the model that I proposed is that 5-MeO is a very good tool to understand the processes of deconstruction of the sense of self, or more radically, a deconstruction of human experience, of essential structures of human experience, that some participants then relate to an experience potentially of pure awareness, an experience without any content whatsoever except awareness itself. This is a potential fruitful avenue for us to study the underpinnings of human consciousness. You strip experience naked out of all the stuff inherent in that experience, and all you have is the awareness itself. On the other hand, DMT, the compound in ayahuasca, induces a very colorful experience, an immersive experience, where individuals feel that they are transported many times to an alternate space, alternate reality. They interact with these beings, and there's a construction of this alternate analog world of sorts, very similar to a dream. And so it speaks about the reconstruction of human experience following this initial breakdown of the habitual world. And so these are the models, these are the tools that I use for the research. So let's begin with the notion of 5-MeO. How is it that 5-MeO is a good model for us to understand deconstructed consciousness, and whether or not that's the case? And so a big part of the research is hinging on this idea that there are certain states of consciousness where consciousness is preserved, but it's very much minimal, where you have no sense of time, space, or self. And this is very consistent with this notion of achieving a minimal phenomenal experience, a term proposed by philosopher Thomas Metzinger. And if we would be able to achieve these states of consciousness via some form of practice or in a specific state of consciousness, we can understand better, for example, the relationship between the sense of self and consciousness more broadly. So the question of whether or not the self is required to have a conscious experience or not is an age-old question in philosophy dating more than 2,000 years. So it's a very, very basic fundamental question. And it has been proposed that in advanced meditation states, meditators can achieve a state without any sense of self whatsoever. I became particularly interested reading reports of 5-MeO because it spoke about something fairly similar, an experience without sense of time, space, or self, and nonetheless awareness remained. And I thought, 5-MeO is a much better model than advanced meditation to achieve these states of pure awareness. Firstly, because it avoids or minimizes this idea of theory of contamination. When these meditators report about their states of consciousness, many times they're not speaking about phenomenology itself, their own lived experience, but they're rather speaking from the texts that they're supposed to be learning from. With 5-MeO, you would not require expertise. You would be able to achieve these states with the induction of the substance. And importantly, we could interrupt that experience, and because there's a drug that is affecting the body, we'd be able to map out those trajectories, and still people would return to the experience, which is very important if we're trying to map out the trajectories of lived experiences and their relationship to the brain. And then finally, we could also understand the molecular underpinnings. Right? With drugs, we alter the molecular dynamics in the brain. And so if we have drugs that induce experiences without a sense of self, but with preserved awareness, we could understand this much better. And so the first study that we did in this regard, that we published earlier this year, was really a phenomenological mapping with advanced interview techniques, trying to map out the trajectories of these experiences and really try to test whether or not there is a state of deconstructed consciousness that emerges here, of pure awareness. And what we found was that in a third of the participants, 30% of them, they achieved this state that we labeled an everything-nothing state of experience, where there's no space, no time, no self, no distinctions in the contents of experience, something like a saturation effect, an overflowing of contents that makes it unable for the attentional resources of the individual to really capture any specific structures of experience, an experience of awareness as such. It didn't happen to all participants, it happened to a third of participants. And this is one of the reports just to give you a sense of that experience. I was not there. It was like accessing whiteness, quiet, blissful, enormous whiteness. I was everything. There was no controller or observer. It was not me having the experience. I don't know what happened. I somehow had a glimpse of the wholeness, the totality of the experience. Then when we looked at the brain, we saw these markers, these biological markers of reduced alpha activity and reduced beta activity, these brainwave patterns that usually serve an inhibitory function in the brain. And so what we find is this disinhibition in terms of brain activity. And so how is it that a state of disinhibition in brain activity where you take out these filters, how could that lead to an experience of pure awareness or a minimal experience? And so one way that we can understand this is with these models, where we think about the brain and the mind as this system that you apply temperature. And if you apply temperature right at that critical range, at that precise range, you see these structures emerging. So the way that we tend to understand these models is that the mind, the contents of the mind, the sense of self, thoughts, they emerge in these specific patterns of activity, right at this precise range. And that will be our typical experience. If you reduce the temperature, if you make brain activity more predictable, more boring, if you will, you would have no experience whatsoever. And this is what we see broadly understood, what we see when we are in states of sleep or deep anesthesia. There's no experience whatsoever. So our data is suggestive that in 5-MeO, you would have this saturation, really, an increase of temperature that would lead to this experience of saturation of content to the point that no elements can be distinguished in the experience itself, an experience of everything and nothing that paradoxically leads to this state of deconstructed consciousness. Something like the TV, the old 90s TV sets where you just saw the ants flowing. And so, driven further into this question, in understanding whether or not these states of pure awareness can be achieved with psychedelics on the one hand, and whether or not there's a correspondence with advanced meditator, is that we were able to locate an experienced meditator who was willing to partake in some of our studies and relate their patterns of brain activity in meditation as well as with 2 doses of 5-MeO DMT. And so that's precisely what we did. We found this Lama with more than 10 years of retreat experience who underwent 2 meditation sessions and 2 5-MeO sessions in the lab. And this is broadly the psychometric scores where we found that there were overlaps in some qualities of that subjective experience. For example, the sense of gaining intuitive knowledge, feelings of positive emotions during the experience, the intensity, as well as feelings of disembodiment and no sense of time, these overlaps. We also found some differences, and there's a lot of nuance there to discuss. But I just want to share also mostly the brain findings, what we found. This is EEG. Again, there's a lot of detail here. But what we found was that the non-dual meditator shared a pattern of brain activity that had, at first glance, a correspondence with the low dose of 5-MeO DMT. Intriguingly, in those patterns, what we found was reduced elements of disinhibition. So something more according to the idea of an inhibited brain state during the low dose of 5-MeO as well as in the non-dual meditation. So something really opposite that we were finding in that high dose with the other participants. So kind of like a subtractive route to that experience of deconstruction in the low dose. But in the high dose, we found the opposite pattern. There was more entropy, more unpredictability in brain activity, more disinhibition. And so the current thinking that we're having is that you can achieve these states of deconstruction via these two alternative pathways. We then directly tested the overlap between meditation and 5-MeO in this case study. And what we find when we applied a machine learning approach, we found that there was a significant correspondence between the low dose and the non-dual meditation. So there's a significant 95, 94% correspondence that we did not find with the other doses. So again, this idea that in this low dose 5-MeO experience that the meditator was having, as well as in the non-dual meditation, they would achieve this state of deconstructed consciousness, but via this subtractive route. And this further adds to this idea that has been going around for decades now, that people achieve similar states of consciousness with meditation and psychedelics. So going back to our model, we would have in high doses of 5-MeO potentially a saturation route in terms of achieving these states of deconstructed consciousness, and in meditation and low dose of 5-MeO, potentially this subtraction route. Now, it's important to mention this is a single case study, but these are the case studies that help us build a hypothesis and then test them on a larger amount of population. Okay, so that's when it comes to this notion of deconstruction and how we're using 5-MeO as a model for deconstructed consciousness so that we can learn better the relationship between mind and brain. How about reconstruction? So for this, we've employed DMT. And the specific content of that experience that we've been using to understand these experiences of construction, where new contents are emerging, are these so-called entity experiences. So 60% of individuals that we find in our studies, when they have these DMT experiences, they encounter these beings, these entities that seem to interact with them. Many times they are meaningful experiences. And so we use them as a model for something constructive emerging out of that experience. And so we did some qualitative work mapping the structures of those experiences when people are having these entity encounters and having experiences of immersion into an alternate reality. And what we find is that in the structure of that experience, first, multisensory effects are happening. Usually the emergence of visuals and a feeling of disembodiment emerges in the experience. Then people feel usually transported into a 3D space, and only then is it that most participants have an encounter with that being or that presence. And so it's kind of like answering that question, how do you build a world that ends up in these experiences of social cognition that emerge during DMT experiences? So we did this experiment, and we did another one with fMRI. And the way that we tested these hypotheses was by using what you call a bolus dose, a fast-acting dose of DMT. And when you do this, you get a sense that all of the interesting thing, all of that phenomenology, that experience, is just happening at the peak of that experience. And that is usually 1 or 2 minutes in that DMT administration. And so because we're interested in understanding the emergence of contents and studying it in the right way, we said, maybe we need to find a way to extend that administration and try to map out by asking people in different minutes in real time in the experience whether or not they're having that specific experience of entities. And that's what we did. And if you could do that, you'd be able to compare by keeping all other elements stable in terms of the drug being administered, the different qualities of that experience. So one person could say the entity is occurring at certain moments, other participants at different moments, and so forth and so on. And by the way, these are the drawings of our participants who come out of that experience, and just to give a sense of what it is that they're experiencing. And actually, I'm missing a slide, it's a shame. But what we found in these experiences was that that state of disinhibition that was found as reductions in alpha power in the brain and beta power, they were attenuated significantly when they were having that entity encounter, that entity experience. It was a normalization of that entropy, or an inhibition of the disinhibition, right at the periods where these entities encounters are happening. And so if we go back into our model, these experiences of construction, we can understand them as this dynamic emergence of contents throughout the experience, where it shifts between noise and disorder and structures of experience and content emerging, the entity encounters. And so the current thinking is that this is also happening in most psychedelic experiences, in the dynamics that are happening in the habitual experience. When people are thrown out in this experience that is confusing, that is unstabling, and then the system, the brain, is striving for meaning. And this could lead to the perception of specific experiences, experiences of insights that can be therapeutically meaningful, and so on and so forth. So the things that arise in the psychedelic experience. So why is this relevant potentially for therapeutic practice? We tend to think that experience, as Guy was mentioning this morning, experience matters. That specific experiences lead to positive outcomes in mental health treatments, in psychedelic therapy. But if we pay attention closely to experience, we tend to find that those experiences are dynamic. They're changing over time. The meaningful patterns that seems to be therapeutic have an ebb and flow. They're not static throughout the experience. And so these are opportunities to engage with that experience that can enhance efficacy and safety when we're thinking about psychedelic practice. And one of the key elements that has been said and that plays a role in that is the role of context or setting. So the context plays a key role in both psychedelic states and development of those traits that are meaningful, therapeutically meaningful many times. Right? And so setting, intentions, and so on. So going back to our model, we can think of the psychedelic as a perturbation to the system, to the organism, that could result in a specific experience like point B, but with context, we could have a dramatically different outcome. So the context, we can think of the therapy, the use of music, and so forth and so on. So we have increasing amount of evidence, is still preliminary, of how that context plays a specific role. And there's still a lot of work to be done. But we have emerging objective data showing, for example, how different contexts might determine patterns of brain activity that are much more identifiable. So this is a very nice study. It's a preprint that came out. This is a representation of brain activity. And the stronger the psychedelic experience, the stronger the differentiation of how the psychedelic experience interacts with rest, meditation, hearing music, or perceiving a movie, or having a movie experience. So we're starting to see how context really interacts in a dramatic way with the psychedelic experience with objective data. I want to show you this experiment, another case study where we're trying to look into this, of how is it that behavior can guide a specific psychedelic experience. In this case, we had a shaman who came into our lab, and spontaneously throughout the experience, this is a DMT extended administration, he started to sing. He started to do his expert practice that he habitually does when he is going through his experiences with ayahuasca. So we mapped out those moments, and then we looked at the brain to see the patterns of brain activity. And what we found is that when no singing was happening whatsoever, we find these signatures, again, of high degree of immersion in this alternate world that we tend to associate to those increases in delta waves in the brain and increases in gamma, as well as decreases in alpha, which you find there. And then we looked at what happens precisely after the moment that he sings, compared to the moments right before he sings. And we find that there's a significant attenuation of those effects. So what the singing does, it seems, a way that we can interpret this, is that it diminishes the feelings of immersion or the intensity of that psychedelic experience. So another way that we can think of this is a marker of how the shaman is navigating that psychedelic experience. How is it taming it in specific directions? I think this is very relevant, especially considering what we can consider noise or difficulties or challenges when looking at qualities of the psychedelic experience. We've published on what are some of the potential epistemic risks related to psychedelic experiences. The idea that a single experience can transform beliefs concerning the nature of reality, induce potentially false memories in therapy, and even induce a form of conspiratorial thinking. So there's a lot of noise that can emerge in these experiences. Here in this paper, actually, we talked about the case of a participant in one of the Imperial trials who had this apparent memory of being smothered by his mother during psilocybin therapy, and the difficulties in trying to assess whether or not that was a factual, truthful memory or not. And so based on this is that we propose this idea that psychedelics may act as a double-edged sword, where these meaning-enhancing qualities or these insightful enhancing qualities of the psychedelic experience can drive efficacy but also compromise the safety of these experiences. And in this context is that we sort of spoke about what are the things that can ameliorate these challenges. How is it that participants can find signal within this ocean of noise in the psychedelic experience? And we proposed this model of psychedelic apprenticeship where there's a strong importance on the role of therapists in scaffolding those experiences, enhancing the safety of them, and making them potentially also more meaningful and efficacious for them. And so a way of understanding of leveraging or adapting that sort of meaning-making process within this wider cultural context, so the way that the experiences are interpreted is safer for people. And there's some emerging evidence here that also therapeutic alliance can play such a role in terms of enhancing the efficacy of these experiences. And so to finish, I think what I find important here is stressing the relevance, the importance of this idea of psychedelic practice. How do we go from this model that we currently have around passivity in these experiences, in the ways that participants can engage with them, so that safety can be enhanced and also efficacy can be enhanced? And a good analogy, I think, is this idea of learning how to surf. When you are learning how to surf, it's incredibly difficult to distinguish what is a worthwhile wave to catch from a wave that could be dangerous to catch. So how to read the signal in the ocean of noise? And I think a lot could be done in research right now in understanding how attention, metacognition, and agency, very importantly, plays a role in these experiences. And a good starting point in this regard is how is it that these experiences can leverage the notion of flow experiences? And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.